The sound of shattering porcelain echoed through the Thompson family's living room like a gunshot. I watched in horror as the antique Chinese vase, the one that had sat on that mahogany table for 3 generations, tumbled to the hardwood floor and exploded into 1,000 pieces. "Emma!" My mother's voice cut through the stunned silence. "What have you done?" I stood frozen, the dust cloth still in my trembling hand. I'd been cleaning, just trying to help prepare for the family gathering. One careless movement, one miscalculation as I reached across the table, and now, this. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean—" I started, but my mother's face had turned a shade of red I'd never seen before. "That vase was worth $5,000. She advanced toward me, her heels clicking ominously on the floor. $5,000, Emma! My older brother Daniel appeared in the doorway, his wife Victoria right behind him. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to something that looked almost like satisfaction. "Jesus, Emma," Daniel said, shaking his head. "Can't you do anything right?" The living room was filling up now. Aunts, uncles, cousins, at least 15 people had gathered for what was supposed to be a casual family dinner. Now they all stood, witness to my humiliation, their faces a mixture of shock and secondhand embarrassment. "It was an accident," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll pay for it. I can pay for it?" Victoria laughed, that sharp, cutting laugh that always made me feel small. "Emma, you work in marketing. It would take you months to save up that kind of money." "She's been nothing but a burden," my mother said, and something in her tone made my blood run cold. This wasn't just anger about a broken vase. This was something deeper, something that had been building for years. Always underfoot, always causing problems. I've had enough. "Mom, please," I said, hating how my voice cracked. "I'll clean it up. I'll replace it. Just, you're no longer family." The words exploded from her mouth with such venom that I actually took a step back. Get out of this house." The room went completely silent. Someone's phone timer beeped in the kitchen, absurdly mundane against the weight of what had just been said. "Margaret, don't you think that's a bit—" My stepfather Robert started, but my mother whirled on him. "No, I'm done, Robert, done. She's 28 years old and still acting like a child, breaking things, disappointing us at every turn. I want her out." I looked around the room desperately, searching for one face, one person who might speak up for me. My cousin Sarah looked down at her shoes. Uncle Jim suddenly became very interested in his phone. Daniel crossed his arms, and I could have sworn I saw the corner of his mouth twitch upward. But then I caught Thomas's eye. The family butler, who'd worked for the Thompsons for over 40 years, stood near the dining room entrance. His weathered face was creased with concern, and something else, something that looked almost like worry, for me or about what was happening. "I'll get my things," I heard myself say. My voice sounded far away, like it belonged to someone else. "You do that," my mother spat, "and don't expect to come crawling back." As I climbed the stairs to my small bedroom, the one I'd been relegated to when Daniel needed his expanded to accommodate his home office, my mind kept replaying my grandfather's words from 3 months ago, just before he'd gotten too sick for regular visits. We'd been sitting in our usual coffee shop, the little one on Newberry Street where nobody from the family ever went. Grandpa William had looked at me with those sharp blue eyes that age hadn't dimmed and said, "Remember, Emma, mistakes don't define family. Character does." I'd nodded, not really understanding what he meant. Now, stuffing clothes into my duffel bag with shaking hands, those words felt like a lifeline. 20 minutes later, I stood in the foyer with my bag. The family had mostly dispersed, but my mother stood guard at the door like she was worried I might steal the silverware on my way out. "Keys," she demanded, holding out her hand. I pulled the house key off my ring and dropped it into her palm. Through the window, I could see snow starting to fall. Of course it was. Of course this was happening on a freezing February night. As I stepped out into the cold, I heard Thomas's voice behind me. "Miss Emma." I turned. He'd followed me to the door, and he pressed something into my hand, a business card. "Your grandfather wanted you to have this," he whispered. "He made me promise to give it to you if something like this ever happened." Before I could respond, my mother's voice rang out, "Thomas, inside. Now." Maybe he gave me one last meaningful look and disappeared back into the house. The door slammed shut behind him. I looked down at the card. It was for a lawyer, Mr. Harrison, estate planning attorney. On the back, in my grandfather's shaky handwriting, "Trust the process, Emma." The snow was falling harder now, and I had nowhere to go. But as I walked away from that house, away from the golden light spilling from its windows, I felt something unexpected alongside the hurt and humiliation. I felt free. Hey everyone, before we continue, if you've ever been treated like you don't belong in your own family, hit that subscribe button. This story gets justice, and I promise you'll want to see how it ends. Now, let's dive into how I got here in the first place. See, that night wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment when everything that had been simmering beneath the surface finally boiled over. To understand why my mother could throw me out over a broken vase, you need to understand the Thompson family. And more specifically, you need to understand my place in it. Or rather, my lack of one. The Thompson family built their fortune in Boston real estate over 3 generations. My grandfather, William Thompson, started with a single apartment building in the 1960s and built it into an empire worth tens of millions. By the time I was born, Thompson Real Estate Holdings owned 15 commercial properties and had a 40% stake in one of Boston's biggest development companies. Growing up, I knew we were wealthy. But wealth, I learned early, doesn't automatically equal love, or even basic kindness. My earliest memory of feeling like an outsider in my own family happened when I was 8 years old. It was Daniel's 13th birthday, a big deal in the Thompson household. My mother and stepfather, Robert, who'd married Mom when I was 6 after my biological father died, had rented out an entire restaurant, hired a live band, and invited over 50 people. I remember standing in the corner of the party venue, wearing my best dress, a hand-me-down from my cousin that was a little too big and a lot too out of style. I watched as Daniel opened present after present. A new laptop, designer clothes, a promise of a car when he turned 16. When it was my turn to give him my gift, a drawing I'd spent weeks perfecting of his favorite superhero, he barely glanced at it before setting it aside and moving on to the next expensive package. "That's very sweet, Emma," my mother had said in that tone she used. The one that sounded nice if you didn't know her, but to me always felt dismissive. Daniel got straight A's again this semester. You know how proud we are of him. The implication was clear. I was trying my best, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But the moment I truly knew, the moment I understood in my bones that I was different, that I was less than, happened when I was 16. I'd been practicing piano for months, determined to finally earn my mother's approval. She'd always praised Daniel's musical talents, and I thought if I could just be good enough, maybe she'd look at me the way she looked at him. One afternoon, I came home from school early and heard voices in the study. The door was cracked open, and I recognized my mother's voice talking to Robert. "I married you for stability," she was saying, "for your money and your name. Emma is just baggage from my past, a reminder of my first marriage that I'd rather forget. As long as she doesn't get in Daniel's way, I don't care what happens to her," Robert replied. "He's the one who matters. He's the one who'll take over the business someday." I stood outside that door, my backpack sliding off my shoulder onto the floor with a soft thud that they didn't hear. My chest felt hollow, like someone had reached in and scooped out everything vital and left me empty. That's when I understood. I wasn't unloved because I'd done something wrong. I was unloved because to my mother, I represented something she wanted to forget. And to Robert, I was simply invisible, a non-entity that existed in the margins of his real family. The rules of the Thompson household became clearer after that. There was what Daniel got, and then there was what I got, and the two were never, ever equal. Daniel had a bedroom that was 300 square feet of prime real estate on the second floor with bay windows overlooking the garden and an ensuite bathroom. My room was barely 120 square feet, tucked away on the third floor next to the storage room, with a bathroom I had to share with whatever guests happened to be staying over. Daniel went to Commonwealth Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in Boston, where tuition ran $40,000 a year. I went to the local public school, not because my family couldn't afford private school, but because, as Robert put it, we need to save where we can. The irony wasn't lost on me that this statement was made 2 days after Daniel received a brand new BMW for his 17th birthday. When it came time for college, Daniel was sent to MIT with a full ride courtesy of the family checkbook. I was told I'd need to show some initiative and figure it out myself. I applied for every scholarship I could find and ended up at community college, working 2 jobs to cover what the financial aid didn't. Daniel's birthday parties were catered events with guest lists that read like Boston's social register. Mine were quiet family dinners where conversation inevitably turned to Daniel's latest achievements while my milestones went unmentioned. But maybe the most painful difference wasn't in the material things. It was in the way they spoke to us, about us, around us. When Daniel made a mistake, and he made plenty, it was framed as a learning experience. When he crashed his BMW into a mailbox his first week of having it, Robert chuckled and said, "Well, that's what insurance is for. We've all been there, son." When I accidentally shrunk Daniel's favorite sweater in the laundry at 19, I'd been trying to help with household chores. My mother screamed at me for 20 minutes about how irresponsible I was, how I never thought about anyone but myself, how I couldn't be trusted with simple tasks. Daniel's opinions were solicited and valued. At 16, he was sitting in on family business meetings, learning the ins and outs of real estate development. At 22, still in college myself, I suggested at a family dinner that one of the properties might benefit from targeting younger renters with some modern updates. Robert had literally held up his hand to stop me mid-sentence and said, "Emma, the adults are talking." I'd sat there, 22 years old, being dismissed like a child because my ideas didn't matter, because I didn't matter. The only person who ever made me feel seen was Grandpa William. While the rest of the family treated me like an inconvenient houseplant, easy to ignore until I was somehow in the way, my grandfather noticed me, really noticed me. He'd slip me $20, for no reason at all, when the family had given me another lecture about being financially responsible. He'd ask about my classes, my job, my life, and actually listen to my answers. When I graduated with my associate degree, he was the only one who came to the ceremony. My mother had said she couldn't get away from work, even though I knew she'd taken that day off to go shopping with Victoria. 2 years before that awful night when everything fell apart, Grandpa William started meeting me for coffee every Sunday at a little shop near Boston Common. These meetings were our secret. I knew instinctively that if the family found out, they'd find a way to ruin it or make him stop. "Tell me what you've been up to," he'd say, settling into our regular booth with his black coffee and apple Danish. And I'd tell him about my job in marketing, about the classes I was taking, about this crazy idea I had about maybe investing in real estate someday. Real estate? His eyes had lit up. "Now that's interesting. What makes you think about that?" "I don't know," I'd said, feeling embarrassed. "It's probably stupid. I see these properties around the city, and I think about what they could be, how they could be improved. I've been watching videos online, reading books from the library. There's this whole world of real estate investing that isn't about massive developments. Just regular people buying properties, fixing them up, creating value." Grandpa William had studied me for a long moment, and I'd braced myself for the dismissal I was so used to. Instead, he'd smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "Emma," he'd said, "you've got the bug. The real estate bug. That's exactly how I started, you know. just seeing potential where others saw problems. Really? I'd leaned forward, hungry for any connection to someone who understood. Really. And I'll tell you something else. You've got something Daniel will never have. What's that? Hunger. Drive. You know what it's like to have to work for things. Daniel's been handed everything on a silver platter. He doesn't understand value because he's never had to create it himself. But you, he'd pointed his finger at me, you understand that success has to be earned. And that, sweetheart, is worth more than any trust fund. Those conversations with Grandpa William sustained me through the worst of the family dynamics. They reminded me that I wasn't crazy, that the way I was being treated wasn't normal or okay, and that maybe, just maybe, I had value even if my family couldn't see it. So when I left home that snowy night with nothing but a duffel bag and a cryptic business card, I held on to those memories, held on to the belief that my grandfather had seen something in me worth believing in. I just didn't know yet how much he'd believed in me, or how spectacularly he'd planned to prove it to the family that had tried so hard to make me disappear. The next few months after being kicked out were some of the hardest of my life. I crashed on my friend Sarah's couch, a different Sarah, not my cousin, in her tiny studio apartment in Alston. I kept going to my marketing job, kept up appearances, but inside I was struggling. The hardest part wasn't the physical discomfort of sleeping on a couch or living out of a duffel bag. It was the silence from my family. Not a single call, not a single text. It was like I'd never existed. Part of me had expected, hoped, maybe, that someone would reach out, that my mother would calm down and realize she'd overreacted, that Daniel might call and say he'd smoothed things over, that even Victoria, for all her passive-aggressive commentary, might at least check if I was okay. Nothing. Radio silence. And that silence said more than any words could have. It confirmed what I'd always suspected. I was easy to discard because I'd never really been valued in the first place. During this time, I found myself spiraling into self-doubt. Late at night, staring at Sarah's ceiling, I'd run through scenarios in my head. Maybe I really was the problem. Maybe if I'd just been smarter, more accomplished, more like Daniel, things would have been different. Maybe I deserved what happened. But then I'd remember Grandpa William's words. Character, not mistakes. And I'd force myself to think rationally. Breaking a vase, even an expensive one, wasn't a reason to disown someone. The vase was just an excuse, a final straw that let my mother do what she'd probably wanted to do for years, remove the reminder of her past that I represented. I started seeing a therapist. Her name was Dr. Chen, and she was the first person I'd ever told the full truth about my family. What you're describing, she'd said during one session, is a pattern of emotional neglect and scapegoating. You weren't the problem, Emma. You were the target. Hearing that from a professional, having my experience validated, was like someone had finally turned on the lights in a room I'd been stumbling through in the dark for years. So what do I do now? I'd asked. Now, Dr. Chen had said, you figure out who you are outside of their narrative. You've spent your whole life trying to earn love from people who were never going to give it. What would happen if you stopped trying? What would you do if you only had to please yourself? That question haunted me in the best way. What would I do? The answer came to me slowly, but when it did, it felt right. I'd pursue the thing I'd been dreaming about in those coffee shop conversations with Grandpa William. I'd learn about real estate investing. I started small. Every spare minute, I was listening to podcasts, reading books, watching YouTube videos about real estate. I learned about house hacking, the BRRR method, creative financing, analyzing deals. The more I learned, the more excited I got. For the first time in my life, I was learning something not because someone told me to, not to win approval, but because I genuinely wanted to. And it felt incredible. I joined a local real estate meetup group in Boston. Walking into that first meeting, held in the back room of a pizza shop in Cambridge, I was terrified. I was 28, had no experience, and felt like a total fraud. But something happened in that room that had never happened in the Thompson family home. People were interested in what I had to say. When I mentioned I'd been analyzing properties in up-and-coming neighborhoods, a guy named Marcus asked to see my analysis. When I sheepishly pulled out the spreadsheet I'd been working on, he actually looked impressed. "This is really thorough," he'd said. "You've got an eye for this." Those simple words of encouragement lit something inside me that I didn't even know had gone dark. 6 months after being kicked out, I made my first real estate investment. It wasn't huge. A house hacking opportunity where I rented out 2 rooms in a 3-bedroom and lived in the 3rd. My share of the mortgage was covered by the rent, and I was building equity. I was terrified. I was excited. I was finally doing something that was entirely mine, and I didn't tell my family a single thing about it. Around this time, Grandpa William's health started declining rapidly. He'd been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and the prognosis wasn't good. I started flying back to Boston every other weekend, using my limited vacation days and whatever cheap flights I could find. The family noticed my visits, of course. They never came when I was there. I made sure to coordinate my timing for when I knew they'd be busy. But Thomas would let me in through the kitchen entrance, and I'd spend hours sitting with Grandpa William, just talking. His body was failing, but his mind was sharp as ever. He wanted to know everything about my life, my therapy, my real estate education, my first investment property. "Tell me about the house," he'd say, his eyes lighting up even as his body grew weaker. "It's in Dorchester," I'd explain. 3 bedrooms, needed some work. I got it below market because it needed updating. I'm doing most of the cosmetic stuff myself. Painting, new fixtures, refinishing the floors. My roommates are helping. We're turning it into something special." "You're doing the work yourself?" He'd smiled at that. "I did that too, you know. My first building, I painted every unit. Your grandmother thought I was crazy, getting paint in my hair when I had a perfectly good job as an accountant. But I wanted to understand every aspect of the business. I'm learning so much," I'd told him. "Every day I'm figuring out something new. And Grandpa, I love it. For the first time, I feel like I'm good at something." "You are good at something," he'd said firmly, reaching for my hand with his frail one. "You're good at a lot of things, Emma. The fact that your mother couldn't see it says everything about her and nothing about you." During one of our last conversations, he'd gotten serious. "Emma, I need you to promise me something." It's me, or anything. "Don't let them make you bitter. What they did to you, what they've always done to you, it wasn't right. But bitterness will poison you from the inside out." He'd squeezed my hand. "Build your life. Build it so well that their opinions become irrelevant. Can you do that?" "I'll try," I'd whispered, tears running down my face because we both knew what this conversation meant. We were running out of time. "I'm proud of you, Emma. Your father would be proud of you too." He was talking about my biological father, the one who died when I was 5, the one whose memory my mother had systematically tried to erase from my life. "You knew him?" I'd asked. "I knew Grandpa William wasn't my father's father. He was my mother's father. They shouldn't have had much overlap. I met him a few times. Good man, hardworking, loved your mother desperately, though I never understood why she seemed so eager to forget him after he passed." He'd paused, gathering strength. "He'd be proud of the woman you're becoming. And Emma?" "Yes. Remember, family isn't always blood. Sometimes it's the people who show up, the people who see you." A week later, he was gone. I got the call from Thomas at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. I'd cried silently in my room, careful not to wake my roommates, mourning the loss of the only person in my family who'd ever truly loved me. The funeral was scheduled for Friday. I booked a flight I couldn't really afford and steeled myself for the first time I'd see my family in over a year. After I left Boston that snowy night, I'd relocated to Portland, Oregon. It was about as far from my family as I could get without leaving the country, and that distance had been necessary. I needed space to figure out who I was without the constant weight of their judgment. Portland had been good to me. The cost of living was lower than Boston, which meant my marketing salary stretched further. More importantly, I'd found a community of people who didn't care about my last name or my family drama. They cared about who I was and what I was building. The real estate meetup group in Portland was bigger and more active than the one in Boston. That's where I met Sarah Mitchell, though it took me a while to trust her. After a lifetime of rejection, trusting people, especially people who seemed too good to be true, didn't come naturally. Sarah was 55, with silver-streaked hair she wore in a perpetual ponytail and a direct way of speaking that I found both terrifying and refreshing. She had 20 properties in her portfolio, and she'd built it all from scratch, starting in her 30s after a divorce left her with 2 kids and a pile of debt. "You remind me of myself," she'd said after hearing me present my analysis of a potential flip property at a meetup. "You've got that look." What look? The look of someone who's got something to prove, not to anyone else, to yourself. She'd studied me with those sharp hazel eyes. Family? I must have looked shocked because she'd laughed. "Honey, I can spot a fellow black sheep from a mile away. We've all got that particular kind of hunger. The kind that comes from being told you're not good enough and deciding to prove them wrong." That conversation led to coffee, which led to Sarah becoming my mentor. She taught me everything about real estate investing that the books and podcasts couldn't. The real, in-the-trenches knowledge that only comes from actually doing it. "You want to know the secret?" she'd ask me during one of our coffee meetings. "It's not about having money. It's about being creative and having the discipline to stick with it when things get hard. Most people quit right before they would have succeeded." Under Sarah's guidance, my investing took off. My first flip made $18,000 in profit after 4 months of work. I'd cried when the check cleared. Actually cried. Because it was the first substantial money I'd ever made that was entirely mine. My second flip made $32,000. My third made $24,000. I was learning with each property, getting better at estimating repairs, negotiating with contractors, understanding what buyers wanted. By the end of my first year in Portland, I'd completed 4 flips and bought my first long-term rental property. I was 29 years old, working a full-time marketing job during the day and building a real estate business at night and on weekends. I was exhausted. I was exhilarated. I was finally building something that was mine. The thing about my family was that they had no idea any of this was happening. They didn't call, didn't check in, didn't care enough to even look me up on social media. As far as they knew, I was probably still struggling, still scraping by, still the disappointing daughter who couldn't even dust a table without breaking a $5,000 vase. That suited me fine. I didn't want their attention. I'd learned the hard way that their attention only came when they wanted something, or when they wanted someone to put down to make themselves feel better. Grandpa William knew, though. Our Sunday phone calls had replaced the coffee shop meetings, and I'd tell him everything. He'd listen to my stories about difficult renovations and nightmare tenants and deals that fell through, and he'd share his own war stories from the early days. "You're doing it right," he'd told me during one of our last calls, his voice weaker than I'd ever heard it. "Building slow, learning the business, not trying to get rich overnight. That's exactly what I did." "I learned from the best," I'd said. "No, Emma, you learned from yourself. I just pointed you in the right direction." Now, 3 years into my Portland life, I had 3 rental properties generating consistent cash flow, had completed a dozen flips, and had built a network of contractors, lenders, and fellow investors. My net worth, something I'd never really thought about before, had crossed $450,000. I was still driving my 2015 Honda Civic, still living in a modest apartment, still saving aggressively because I'd learned that building wealth wasn't about looking rich. It was about being patient and reinvesting profits. My marketing job had evolved too. I'd gone remote and started consulting, which gave me more flexibility and better income. Between the consulting and the real estate, I was making about $145,000 a year. To put that in perspective, Daniel, running the family business with Robert, made $300,000 a year in salary alone. But he also lived in a penthouse, drove a Mercedes, and had no savings that I knew of. His wealth was inherited and flashy. Mine was earned and quiet. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd probably learned more about real estate and business in 3 years than Daniel had learned in his entire life of working for the family company. But nobody in the Thompson family knew that, and I liked it that way. I'd built a life in Portland that felt authentic in a way nothing ever had in Boston. I had friends who liked me for me, not for my family name. I had work that fulfilled me. I had proof, concrete, numerical proof, that I was capable and competent and absolutely not the failure my family had always implied I was. The only person from my old life who'd been part of this journey was gone now. Grandpa William had died 2 weeks before I had to fly back for his funeral. I dreaded going back to Boston, dreaded seeing my family, dreaded the inevitable awkwardness, dreaded having to act like we were a normal family grieving normally when the truth was that I was probably the only one who'd actually miss him. But I went because Grandpa William deserved to have someone at his funeral who'd actually loved him. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that the funeral was just the opening act. The real show wouldn't start until 3 days later, at the reading of the will. And when it did, every single thing my family believed about me, about themselves, about the empire that bore our name, all of it was about to be turned completely upside down. The funeral was exactly what I expected, a perfectly choreographed performance of grief that had more to do with appearances than actual mourning. The church was packed with Boston's business elite, society figures, and what felt like half the city's real estate industry. Everyone wanted to pay respects to William Thompson, the man who'd built an empire from nothing. I sat in the back row, not because I wanted to, but because when I'd arrived, every seat near the front was already claimed by family members who'd looked right through me like I was a stranger who'd wandered in by mistake. Victoria had actually stepped in front of me when I'd tried to move toward the family section, her black Chanel suit probably worth more than my entire wardrobe. "I think there's more room in the back," she'd said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We need to save these seats for close family." I was close family. I was his granddaughter. But I'd learned years ago that pointing out obvious truths to people determined not to see them was a waste of energy. So I'd simply nodded and found a seat near the back exit. From there, I watched my mother dab at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, watched Daniel put his arm around her in a show of supportive son solidarity, watched Robert accept condolences with the solemn dignity of a man who'd lost a father figure. The irony was almost funny. In the last year of Grandpa William's life, I'd visited him more than all of them combined. I'd sat with him through chemotherapy appointments they were too busy to attend. I'd held his hand through the pain they didn't want to see. I'd been there. But now, in death, they claimed him, performed their grief for the assembled crowd like actors who'd rehearsed their roles. The minister spoke about William's legacy, his business acumen, his dedication to family. That last part almost made me laugh out loud. Grandpa William had been dedicated to family, just not necessarily to the people who shared his DNA. After the service, there was a reception at the family mansion. I almost didn't go, but Thomas had caught my eye as people filed out of the church and given me a small nod. Something about that gesture made me feel like I should be there. The mansion looked the same as it had the night I'd been kicked out 3 years ago. Same marble floors, same crystal chandeliers, same oil paintings of ancestors who all seemed to be looking down their noses at whoever passed by. The only difference was that this time I was a guest, not a resident, and somehow that made it easier. I stayed on the periphery, accepting quiet condolences from people who vaguely remembered me as William's granddaughter. I watched my family work the room, networking even at a funeral, turning grief into business opportunities. Emma. The voice made me turn. It was Marcus Chen, an attorney I'd worked with on some of my Portland real estate deals. "I didn't expect to see you here." Marcus, what are you? This is my grandfather's funeral. I know. He glanced around, then lowered his voice. I'm here in a professional capacity. Your grandfather contacted me about a year ago, asked me to verify some information. What kind of information? Before he could answer, Thomas appeared at my elbow. Miss Emma, there's someone who'd like to speak with you, in the library, if you don't mind. I followed Thomas through the familiar hallways, aware of Marcus trailing behind us. The library had always been my favorite room in the house. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, leather chairs, the smell of old paper and furniture polish. Grandpa William had spent hours here. Sitting in one of the leather chairs was a woman I recognized immediately, even though we'd never been formally introduced. Catherine Langford, CEO of Langford Industries, one of the most successful real estate developers on the East Coast. She was 78 years old, silver-haired, and had a reputation for being brilliant and absolutely terrifying. Emma Thompson, she said, standing to shake my hand. Her grip was firm. I've been wanting to meet you for quite some time. I don't understand. Your grandfather was my mentor for 40 years, she said. He talked about you often in the last few years, showed me photos of your properties in Portland, played me that podcast episode you did with Bigger Pockets. He was very proud of you. I felt tears prick my eyes. He never told me he'd done that. William was a private man. He didn't believe in making a fuss. She smiled. But he believed in you, Emma, more than you probably realize. You'll understand more at the will reading. The will reading? 3 days from now, I'll be there, as will Mr. Chen here. Your grandfather specifically requested our presence. She gathered her coat. I'll see you then. And Emma, hold your head high. You've earned it. After she left, I stood in the library feeling more confused than ever. Why would Grandpa William invite Catherine Langford to his will reading? Why would he need Marcus to verify information about me? The next 3 days passed in a strange blur. I stayed at a modest hotel near the airport. No way was I staying at the family mansion, and my old apartment had long since been rented to someone else. I spent the time working remotely, taking calls about properties in Portland, trying to distract myself from the growing anxiety about the will reading. My family didn't contact me once. Not to ask where I was staying, not to coordinate travel, nothing. The silence was familiar, but it still stung. The morning of the will reading, I dressed carefully in a simple black dress and blazer. Professional, but not flashy. I didn't want to give them any reason to criticize me, any excuse to make comments about how I looked or what I was wearing. The reading was scheduled for 10 a.m. at the offices of Harrison & Associates, the law firm that had handled the Thompson family's affairs for decades. The building was old Boston money, brick facade, brass fixtures, oil paintings in the lobby. I arrived 15 minutes early and was directed to a large conference room on the 3rd floor. The room was already filling up with people, family members, business partners, representatives from various charities Grandpa William had supported. Daniel and Victoria were in the front row, looking confident and entitled. My mother sat beside Robert, her expression a mixture of grief and barely concealed anticipation. Various aunts, uncles, and cousins filled in the other seats. And then there were the others. People I didn't know, but who seemed to know each other. Business associates, probably. People from Grandpa William's professional life. I spotted Catherine Langford sitting quietly in a corner, dressed in an elegant navy suit. Marcus Chen stood near the windows reviewing something on his tablet. Thomas, the butler, sat with the other household staff along the side wall. I took a seat in the back row, trying to make myself small and invisible. Just get through this, I told myself. Then you can go back to Portland and forget this whole nightmare. Mr. Harrison entered precisely at 10. He was probably 70, with the kind of dignified bearing that came from decades of handling wealthy families and their complicated affairs. He set a leather portfolio on the table at the front of the room and surveyed the assembled crowd. "Good morning," he said. "Thank you all for being here. Before we begin, I want to say that what we're about to discuss may come as a surprise to some of you. Mr. Thompson was very specific about his wishes, and I ask that you allow me to read through the entire will before asking questions." My mother nodded regally like she was giving permission. Victoria had her phone out, probably ready to record the moment she inherited millions. "Let's begin," Mr. Harrison said, opening the portfolio. He started with the standard legal language. "I, William Theodore Thompson, being of sound mind and body," and then moved on to the specific bequests. "To the Boston Children's Hospital, I leave the sum of $50,000. Murmurs of approval around the room. Generous but not extravagant for a man of Grandpa William's wealth. "To the New England Real Estate Foundation, I leave the sum of $50,000. More approving nods. "To Thomas Winters, who has served my family faithfully for 42 years, I leave the sum of $25,000 and the cottage on the Cape Cod property, to be his for as long as he wishes to live there." Thomas's eyes widened. I saw tears on his weathered cheeks. At least someone appreciated him. Mr. Harrison continued through a list of smaller bequests, personal items to various friends, donations to other charities. Everyone waited politely, but I could feel the anticipation building. These were the appetizers. Everyone was waiting for the main course. "And now," Mr. Harrison said, "we come to the primary estate. But before I read those provisions, Mr. Thompson left a personal statement that he wished to be read aloud." He pulled out a separate sheet of paper, and I recognized my grandfather's letterhead immediately. The room went completely silent. Mr. Harrison began to read. "To my family, I built Thompson Real Estate from nothing, through hard work, integrity, and a genuine care for the communities we served. For years, I watched how you treated those around you, especially the most vulnerable among us. I watched who showed up when it mattered. I watched who understood the values I tried to instill. This will reflect those observations." The atmosphere in the room shifted. Something in that statement made people uneasy. I saw Daniel sit up straighter. Victoria stopped recording. Mr. Harrison continued, "To my grandson, Daniel Thompson, I leave the sum of $100,000 with the hope that you will learn fiscal responsibility and the value of earning rather than inheriting success. I also hope you will reflect on how you treat those you perceive as beneath you." The room erupted. Daniel's face went bright red. "Wait, what? That's it?" "Please," Mr. Harrison said firmly, "allow me to finish." But people were already talking, whispering. $100,000 was nothing compared to what everyone had expected Daniel to inherit. That was barely enough for a year of his current lifestyle. "To my daughter, Margaret Thompson Foster, I leave the sum of $50,000 and the vacation house in Cape Cod, with the hope that you will one day understand that love should not be conditional, and children are not possessions to be discarded when they disappoint you." My mother stood up, her face white. "This is absurd. He was senile. This will is invalid." "Mrs. Foster, I assure you that your father was of completely sound mind when this will was drafted. I have medical documentation to that effect. Please sit down or I'll have to ask you to leave." Robert pulled my mother back into her seat, but she was shaking with rage. My heart was pounding. The way Grandpa William's message had been worded, the reference to discarded children, everyone in the room knew he was talking about me. People were starting to look around, probably wondering where I was sitting. Mr. Harrison's voice cut through the chaos. "And now we come to the bulk of the estate, to my granddaughter, Emma Catherine Thompson." Everyone turned to look at me. I felt frozen, unable to move or breathe. "Who has endured years of neglect and cruelty with grace and dignity, who built herself from nothing without asking for handouts, who visited me every week when others were too busy, who showed me what true character looks like—" "This is ridiculous," Victoria shouted. "She's barely been around. She left. She abandoned the family." "Mrs. Thompson, another outburst and you'll be removed. These are Mr. Thompson's wishes and they will be respected." He turned back to the will. I leave the entirety of Thompson Real Estate holdings, including the primary estate valued at $8.5 million, 15 commercial properties with a combined value of $22 million, 40% stake in Thompson Development Corporation valued at $18 million, investment portfolio valued at $12 million, and cash reserves of $5 million. Total estate value, $65.5 million. The room exploded into chaos. People were shouting, standing, pointing. My mother was screaming something about lawyers and fraud. Daniel had gone from red to purple, looking like he might actually have a stroke. I sat perfectly still, unable to process what I'd just heard. $65.5 million. The entire Thompson empire. Everything. It had to be a mistake. Additionally, Mr. Harrison raised his voice to be heard over the chaos. I leave all control and voting rights to Emma, with the condition that Daniel may remain as chief operating officer if Emma chooses. But all major business decisions require Emma's approval. No! My mother's scream was primal. This isn't happening. She manipulated him. She's a gold digger. That's enough. Catherine Langford stood up, and something about her presence commanded immediate attention. The room quieted slightly. For those who don't know me, I'm Catherine Langford, CEO of Langford Industries. William Thompson was my mentor for 4 decades. He was the sharpest businessman I've ever known, and he was absolutely of sound mind when he made these decisions. She turned to address the room. 6 months ago, William called me. He told me about his granddaughter, Emma, about her real estate career in Portland. He asked me to verify her accomplishments independently. I did. Everything in that will is factually accurate. Marcus Chen stepped forward. I'm Marcus Chen, Emma's attorney in Portland. Mr. Thompson contacted me a year ago and asked me to provide documentation of Emma's business activities. I can verify that Emma Thompson has built a real estate portfolio worth approximately $3.5 million entirely on her own, with no family money. She owns 25 rental units, maintains a monthly passive income of $25,000, and has been featured in the Portland Business Journal as one of the city's top young investors. Gasps around the room. People were staring at me with new eyes, some with respect, some with confusion, some with barely concealed anger. That's impossible, Daniel said. She was working in marketing. She was broke. I'm very much not broke, I heard myself say. My voice sounded strange, distant. I've been building a real estate business for 3 years. Grandpa William knew because I told him. He was the only one who cared enough to ask about my life. You manipulated him, Victoria shrieked. You took advantage of a dying old man. I visited him, I said, standing now. My legs were shaking, but I forced them to hold me up. Every other week I flew across the country to sit with him. Where were you? Where were any of you? We were busy running his business, Daniel shot back. Into the ground, from what I hear. The words came from Thomas, of all people. The old butler stood up, his voice steady. In the last 2 years, company profits have declined 15% under your management, Mr. Daniel. Mr. Thompson was very concerned about the direction you were taking the business. Daniel looked like he'd been slapped. You have no right. I have every right. I've worked for this family for 42 years. I watched Miss Emma grow up being treated like she didn't matter. I watched her try desperately to earn love from people who never planned to give it, and I watched her leave and build a life that would make anyone proud. Mr. Thompson saw that. Why couldn't any of you? The room was silent now. People were processing, calculating, trying to figure out what this meant. My mother's expression had changed. The rage was still there, but now it was mixed with something else. Fear, maybe. The realization that she'd miscalculated badly. Emma, she said, and her voice had taken on a syrupy sweet tone I'd never heard before. Emma, sweetheart, I think there's been a misunderstanding. We've always supported you. We've always believed in you. I stared at her. You kicked me out 3 years ago over a broken vase. You told me I was no longer family. You haven't called or texted once since then. I was upset. I didn't mean, yes, you did. You meant every word. I turned to Mr. Harrison. I'd like to schedule a private meeting tomorrow to discuss the specifics of the estate. I need time to process this. Of course, miss. Thompson, shall we say 9 a.m.? That works. I gathered my bag, my hands still trembling. Catherine Langford and Marcus Chen moved to stand beside me, a silent show of support. Emma, wait! Daniel was on his feet. We need to talk about this, about the business, about... All communication goes through my attorney, I said. Marcus will give you his contact information. You can't just walk out. Victoria was recording again, probably already planning her social media rant. This affects all of us. Actually, I said, turning back to face her, it affects me, just me. For the first time in my life, something is actually about me. I walked out of that conference room with my head high, Catherine and Marcus flanking me like bodyguards. Behind me, I could hear my mother's voice rising again, hear the chaos resuming, but I kept walking. The next morning, I met with Mr. Harrison in a smaller, quieter conference room, just the two of us plus Marcus sitting in as my attorney. I know this is overwhelming, Mr. Harrison said kindly. Why don't we start with questions? What do you want to know? Is it really $65 million? The number still seemed impossible. The estate has been appraised at $65.5 million, yes, though with market fluctuations, that number could be higher or lower, depending on when assets are liquidated or maintained. I sat back in my chair, trying to wrap my mind around it. 3 years ago, I'd been sleeping on a friend's couch with $200 in my bank account. Now I was apparently worth tens of millions. What about Daniel? The provision about him staying on as COO. Mr. Harrison pulled out another document. Your grandfather was very specific about this. Daniel may remain in his current role for a probationary period of 6 months. His salary would be adjusted to market rate. Approximately $120,000 annually, down from his current $300,000. He would have no equity, no profit sharing, and all major decisions would require your approval. Why would Grandpa William give him that option at all? He said, and I quote, Daniel needs to learn that leadership is earned, not inherited. If Emma chooses to give him that opportunity, and if he rises to the occasion, it could be good for both of them. But if he proves himself incapable or unwilling to change, Emma should fire him immediately. I almost laughed. That sounded exactly like something Grandpa William would say. What about my mother, the Cape Cod house? That's hers outright. The property is worth approximately $1.2 million. Along with the $50,000 in cash, it's not an insignificant inheritance, but it's a fraction of what she expected. She's going to fight this, isn't she? She can try. But your grandfather was meticulous. The will was drafted by 3 different law firms. His mental competency was documented by 4 separate physicians, and he even recorded a video statement explaining his reasoning. Any legal challenge would be expensive and ultimately futile. I thought about that. Thought about my mother spending her $50,000 on lawyers trying to overturn a will that was airtight. Let her try, I said finally. I'm not giving in to her, not anymore. There's one more thing, Mr. Harrison said. He pulled out an envelope with my name on it in Grandpa William's handwriting. He asked me to give you this after the will reading. It's a personal letter. My hands shook as I took it. I waited until I was back in my hotel room to open it. The letter was 3 pages long, written in my grandfather's increasingly shaky handwriting. I read it sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, tears streaming down my face. My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then the will has been read, and you now know the truth. You've inherited everything because you earned it, not through blood or birth, but through character. I watched you for 28 years, Emma. I watched your mother treat you like an inconvenience. I watched your brother belittle you. I watched them try to make you small so they could feel big, and I watched you refuse to become bitter. When you left that house 3 years ago, I was proud of you. Not because you left, but because you chose yourself. You chose growth over comfort, independence over acceptance. That took courage. I've been tracking your real estate career through Thomas, through the research I commissioned, through our conversations. You built a $3 million portfolio with no help, no connections, and no advantages. Do you understand how extraordinary that is? The empire I'm leaving you isn't a gift. It's recognition. You've already proven you know how to build something from nothing. Now I'm giving you the opportunity to take what I built and make it better. Daniel was handed everything and learned nothing. You were given nothing and learned everything. That's why you get the empire. That's why you deserve it. Don't let them guilt you. Don't let them manipulate you. They had years to treat you with love and respect, and they chose not to. The consequences of that choice are theirs to bear, not yours. Be bold, Emma. Be brilliant. Be exactly who you've become without their approval. I love you. I'm proud of you. Your father would be proud of you too. Go build something amazing. Your grandpa, William. I read that letter 3 times before I finally fell asleep, clutching it to my chest like it might disappear if I let go. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, paperwork, and phone calls. I'd extended my stay in Boston indefinitely, working remotely while I tried to understand the full scope of what I'd inherited. The primary estate alone was overwhelming. $8.5 million for a house I'd been kicked out of 3 years ago. The commercial properties were spread across Boston and the surrounding areas. The 40% stake in Thompson Development Corporation meant I was now a major player in one of the city's biggest real estate development firms. And then there were the calls. Oh God, the calls. My mother called 17 times the first day. I didn't answer. She left voicemails that ranged from rage, "You manipulated him, you're dead to me," to saccharine sweetness. "Sweetheart, let's talk about this like family," to desperate pleading. "Please, Emma, we can work this out." I deleted them all. Daniel's approach was different. He sent emails, professional, business-like emails that pretended the last 3 years hadn't happened and that yesterday's meltdown was just a minor misunderstanding. "Emma, I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss the transition. I have some concerns about the business that need immediate attention. Daniel." I forwarded the email to Marcus with a note. "Please respond that all communication should continue going through you, and that I'll make decisions about the business after I've had time to review everything thoroughly." Victoria, surprisingly, was silent, but her Instagram told the whole story. She'd posted a long caption about family betrayal and greedy relatives that had gotten thousands of sympathetic comments from people who had no idea what they were actually commenting on. I didn't respond, didn't engage. I'd learned a long time ago that you can't win an argument with people who refuse to hear you. A week after the will reading, I arranged a meeting with my family, not because I wanted to see them, but because I needed to set boundaries clearly and definitively. The meeting was at a conference room at Harrison and Associates, neutral ground. Marcus was there, as was Catherine Langford, who'd insisted on coming for moral support. My mother, Robert, Daniel, and Victoria arrived together. They looked tired. Good. I hoped they'd been losing sleep over this. "Thank you for coming," I said, my voice level and professional. I'd practiced this. "I asked you here because I want to be clear about my expectations going forward." "Emma," my mother started, reaching across the table like she was going to touch my hand. I pulled back. "I'm going to speak, and you're going to listen. After I'm done, you can respond, but I won't engage in arguments." Her face tightened, but she nodded. "For 28 years, I tried to earn your love. I tried to be good enough, smart enough, accomplished enough. I changed myself in every way I could think of, hoping that one day you'd look at me the way you looked at Daniel." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "3 years ago, you kicked me out over a broken vase. You told me I was no longer family. And you know what? You were right. Not because I wasn't worthy of being family, but because you never treated me like family in the first place. Emma, we were trying to teach you, my mother started. No, you were trying to control me. There's a difference. And when I left, not one of you checked to see if I was okay. Not one of you called to see if I had a place to stay, money for food, any kind of support. I was out there completely alone, and none of you cared enough to even ask. Silence. Victoria was looking at her manicured nails. Robert was staring at the table. So I built a life without you. I went to therapy. I learned about real estate. I worked 16-hour days and saved every penny. I built a portfolio worth $3.5 million with absolutely no help from any of you. We didn't know, Daniel tried. You didn't know because you didn't ask. You didn't care, and that's fine. You're allowed not to care, but you're not allowed to rewrite history now that there's money involved. I pulled out the documents I'd prepared with Marcus. Daniel, you can remain as COO under the terms Grandpa Williams specified. 6 months probationary, reduced salary, no equity, and I have final approval on all major decisions. If you want the job under those conditions, sign this contract. If not, you're fired as of today. I slid the contract across the table. Daniel stared at it like it might bite him. Mom, the Cape Cod house is yours, as is the $50,000. Those are your final inheritances. There will be no additional financial support from the estate. You'll need to figure out how to manage on what you have. Emma, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. I'm being more generous than you were with me when you threw me out with nothing. We're family, Victoria burst out. You can't just cut us off. I turned to look at her. Victoria, you're not even blood family. You married into this, and you've spent 3 years making snide comments about my life on social media. I owe you less than nothing. Her face went bright red. Here's what's going to happen, I continued. All communication with me goes through Marcus for the next 12 months minimum. I need that time to process everything, to learn the business, to make decisions without pressure from people who've spent my entire life trying to make me feel worthless. This is ridiculous, my mother said, standing up. You've let this inheritance go to your head. You're being cruel. I stood up too, facing her directly. No, Mother, I'm being exactly as kind as you taught me to be. I'm treating you exactly the way you treated me. We're family. Well, she screamed, and there it was. The same rage I'd seen 3 years ago over a broken vase. No, I said quietly. DNA doesn't make family. Love makes family. Respect makes family. Support makes family. You never gave me any of those things. Grandpa William did. Sarah Mitchell in Portland did. Marcus and Catherine and Thomas did. They're my family. You're just people I'm related to. I gathered my things. Daniel, you have 48 hours to decide about the COO position. After that, the offer is withdrawn. Everyone else, I'll see you at board meetings if you're still shareholders, and nowhere else. You'll regret this, my mother said, her voice shaking with rage. Family is everything, Emma. You're right, I said. Family is everything. That's why I've chosen to build one that actually values me. I walked out with Catherine and Marcus, leaving them sitting in that conference room. I could hear Victoria's voice rising behind me, could hear my mother crying, could hear Daniel trying to calm them both down, but I kept walking. 6 months later, I stood in the lobby of Thompson Real Estate Holdings, looking at the company directory that now listed me as CEO. Daniel had signed the contract, after letting it sit for 47 hours, and was working under my supervision. To his credit, he was trying, really trying. He showed up on time, presented thorough reports, and mostly kept his opinions about my management style to himself. We weren't friends. We probably never would be, but we were learning to be professional. The business was thriving under the changes I'd implemented. I'd brought in new property managers, updated our technology systems, and shifted focus towards sustainable development projects that benefited the communities we served. Profits were up 40% in 6 months. My mother had indeed hired lawyers to contest the will. They'd spent 3 months and most of her $50,000 before admitting defeat. The will was airtight. Now she lived in the Cape Cod house, mostly alone because Robert had quietly filed for separation after losing access to the family money he'd married into. Victoria had divorced Daniel 2 months after the will reading. Apparently being married to a guy making $120,000 instead of millions wasn't what she'd signed up for. Daniel was devastated, but I suspected he was better off. As for me, I split my time between Portland and Boston. My Portland properties were still generating strong passive income, managed by the team I'd built there. In Boston, I was learning to run a much larger operation, making mistakes and correcting them, growing into the role Grandpa William had believed I could fill. I'd created the William Thompson Scholarship, $100,000 annually for young people from broken families who wanted to pursue careers in real estate. The first recipients had just been announced, and I'd cried reading their applications, seeing my own story reflected in theirs. I'd bought my first commercial property under my own leadership, a 24-unit apartment building downtown. I'd named it William's Legacy, and I'd had a plaque installed at the entrance with his quote, "Character, not mistakes." One Sunday morning, I drove out to the cemetery where Grandpa William was buried. I'd been coming every week, same as when he was alive, continuing our tradition even though now I was the only one talking. I sat on the bench near his headstone and told him everything, about the business, about Daniel actually trying to step up, about the scholarship recipients, about my first major acquisition as CEO. They told me I'd never be enough, I said, placing fresh flowers on his grave. But you always told me different. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Thank you for teaching me that family is something you choose, not something you're born into. The sun was breaking through the clouds, warming my face. I thought about the scared, hurt girl who'd left the Thompson mansion with nothing but a duffel bag and a broken heart. I thought about the woman I'd become, someone who'd built an empire not once, but twice. Someone who'd learned that her worth wasn't determined by other people's inability to see it. I promise I'll use this legacy wisely, I said. I'll build something that makes you proud, something that helps people who feel invisible feel seen, because that's what you did for me. As I drove back to the office, my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah in Portland. "How's the empire treating you, kiddo?" I smiled. "Like I earned it," I typed back. "Exactly like I earned it." And for the first time in my life, I believed it completely. They'd kicked me out over a broken vase, telling me I wasn't family. But in reality, I'd never really been in. And that turned out to be the greatest gift they could have given me. Because it forced me to build something better than what they'd offered, a life where I wasn't just included.